In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to build a 2-inch Cinewhoop that's under 250 grams, has DJI O3 on board, can carry a naked GoPro, and it has remote ID on a switch. Alright guys, I've been using this drone since August 2023 or so. I'm filming this at the beginning of March and I still love how this thing performs. I haven't changed any parts on it and I wanted to give you guys a little build video. So I've been using it on dozens of projects, from slower indoor real estate drone tours to faster stuff for supercharged and even above crowds at events. It's a very versatile Cinewhoop. Since I use this drone indoors and outdoors under a Part 107, technically it needs remote ID regardless of it being under 250 grams. If you're not making money with this drone or using it commercially, you can skip over the remote ID part. If you're choosing not to comply, you don't have to flood my comment section with why you're not complying. I really don't care. Don't install remote ID. I am, so in this build, I'll be showing you how to install remote ID and how to put it on a switch. So with the switch functionality, you can turn remote ID off when you're flying indoors. Then if you're flying outdoors, you can turn it on. Let's get into the build and let's go over all the parts that are going to be going into this drone. For the frame, we're using the QAV Pro Nano. Now this is a 2-inch carbon fiber Cinewhoop frame that's lightweight and perfect for a build like this. For the flight controller ESC, I'm going to be using Hakrc's F7 all-in-one 40 amp board. I actually have this board on quite a few of my Cinewhoops and it's one of my favorites. And for a lightweight drone build like we're doing in this video, this board is perfect because it only weighs 9 grams. For video transmission, we're going to be using the DJI O3 Air Unit, and we're also going to be using this Flywoo Naked O3 case kit. Now this kit is going to basically take the weight of the O3 Air Unit from 36 grams to about 20 grams. Motors. For motors, we're using Flywoo 1203 4850 kV motors. So this drone is going to be 4S. These motors are awesome. They come in at a pretty reasonable price and they are pretty lightweight. These motors are rated for 4S. Now, even though our flight controller is rated for 6S, we are going to be running 4S on this drone. For the receiver, I'm going to be using a TBS Crossfire Nano RX, and I also have one of these smaller 900 megahertz antennas from Rush FPV. You can use an ELRS receiver on this build if you wanted to. This drone is going to be remote ID compliant. If you choose to build this drone and you don't want it to be remote ID compliant, you don't have to install this. I'm going to be installing it because this is one that I use for my business. I have a whole dedicated video to the drone tag BS and a couple other drone tag modules that I tested out. Since I use this drone indoors and outdoors, I don't need remote ID when I'm flying indoors for real estate. So we're going to be installing this little switch right here. This is a real pit switch that you can get for about $5. This is going to make it so that I can turn the remote ID module on or off. Once we get the remote ID module installed, I'll show you guys how to get this set up. For props, we're using Gemfan's ducted 51mm 5-blade props. And I'm going to also be using some fabric tape. This isn't required, but it will keep your motor wires nice and clean. You can get this for, I don't know, $2 on Race Day Quads. All right, let's get right into it. Let's get our frame open and we'll start assembling this drone. First thing we're going to do is we're going to mount the motors. So we're going to take our frame and flip it upside down. You'll notice that this text right here that says Cinequads or over here Lumineer, we're going to flip it upside down because this is the top and we're going to basically be mounting the motors upside down. So the motors are going to be mounted right to this. Each motor comes with its own bag of screws. You're going to notice that there's 2 longer screws and then 4 smaller screws. These 4 smaller screws we're actually going to push to the side and we're not going to be using these because we're going to be using the screws that come with the frame. This is the bag that came with the frame, and as you can see, they include pretty much every screw you'll need. I'm going to be using these top smaller screws to mount the motors. So we'll take all of these out and we are going to use all of these to mount the motors. When you're mounting the motors, just pay attention to where the wire is running. I would recommend having it go along this inner carbon fiber brace for the motor. And then our flight controller is going to sit right here. So take a smaller screw, make sure you're using the smaller screw. You don't want these screws to go through and into the motor windings because then your motor is probably not going to work. Just make sure that the screws aren't going into the motor winding. We should be good because these are pretty small. So I'm going to go through and mount all my motors just like that. Now we've got our motors all mounted. I'm gonna run these wires underneath the frame right now so that we can start dealing with the flight controller. This flight controller comes with an XT60. You can save this for another drone. We're gonna be using the XT30 that came with our frame. So something that I really like about this frame is that it has a fixed XT30 mount. So they include the little 3D printed piece right here, but pretty much how this works is this piece is gonna go, this piece is gonna sit right here, and inside is gonna be this XT30 mount. They don't include any wiring for the XT30 for some reason in the QAV kit, so I'm gonna be using some of this wiring that came with the flight controller. We're gonna be able to trim this down a lot. When we install this on the drone, we're gonna want these pads facing up, and we're also gonna wanna make sure that our USB is facing out. So the QAV Nano frame comes with 25 by 25 mounting in 2 different spots. We're gonna use the forward mounting for this. Make sure you're looking at the front of the frame. This is the rear where you see this little groove right here. That's actually for the O3 Air Unit antenna. This is the rear, this is the front. We're gonna use this set of 25 by 25 mounting for the flight controller, and then we're gonna use these rear ones for the O3 Air Unit once we get to it. So when we mount the flight controller, we're gonna want it facing like this. So we're gonna want easy access to all these pads. That's gonna also put the DJI O3 plug and play port right in the back, right next to the O3 Air Unit, and we'll have access to the USB port. So what we're gonna do next is install these rubber grommets. These come with the flight controller. Quick tip on how to install these. Get some dental floss, put it through the top of the board. We're gonna want the thicker end of the rubber grommet on the bottom. So we're gonna go like this, put it through the hole, open up the dental floss so that we can put our grommet through it, have it right like that, and we're gonna pretty much pull the thinner side through the hole. Right like that. Now do the same thing for the remaining 3. That was actually pretty difficult. I don't know how you would get those in without dental floss. Before we get it mounted, we want to make sure that our XT30 is ready to go. Now, like I mentioned, the XT30 in this frame is actually fixed to the frame. So this little TPU piece right here is going to hold the XT30 in place, and this is going to sit right in this little triangular cutout in the top of the frame. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna solder up some wires to the XT30, and then we'll get it hooked up to the flight controller. So I'm gonna take these wires that came with the flight controller, and I'm gonna cut it down to about 40 millimeters or so. Some of this blue tack, you can get this on Amazon for like $6. I'll leave a link to this down in the description as well. This is just helpful for kind of holding wires in place and holding, you know, little things like this so you can solder to it easier. We'll put some flux on these battery pads right here. We'll tin these. And now we'll put the wires on. Flat side is positive, round side is negative. There we go, perfect. So we'll put this aside for now. Before we take our XT30 pigtail and secure it to the board, let's get our capacitor hooked up to the flight controller. So to do this, what I've been doing when there's really not a lot of space to work with in a drone, I just put the capacitor right on top of the board, right like that. So that's what I'm gonna do in this one, and it's gonna sit pretty much right near the USB port. So it's pretty much gonna be just kind of sitting like that. So what we'll do is kind of take a look at how you have your capacitor sitting. So I'm gonna take these 2 poles and I'm just gonna bend them down a little bit, kind of like right there. So I'm gonna have my capacitor sitting right like that. Cut the capacitor ends right about there. Perfect. We'll put some flux on the capacitor ends. Flux capacitor. Tin up these capacitor ends just so they're easier to solder to the board. And I'm just gonna put a little bit of heat shrink around this just to keep these safe. Tin these pads. Just a little bit, you don't need much. And just do one at a time. There's one. So now our capacitor is all soldered up to the flight controller. Now let's get the battery lead hooked up. With those spliced, I'm gonna put some solder on there. Now it's time to hook up the XT30 to the flight controller. Positive, negative, positive, negative. There we go. So now we have our power lead all hooked up. All right, so now to install the fixed XT30. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take the little TPU piece. This fits on that triangular cutout right up front, only one way. Make sure you're installing this with the motors facing down. So we're gonna be installing it right from this side. So we're gonna feed this side in first, and then this is going to pretty much just fall right into place. So there is our XT30 mount. Now what we do is we take the XT30 mount right here, and this is just gonna be fed in right through the bottom. So get it lined up, fits in only one way, and then just press it in. It takes a little bit of force, but once it's in, it's not coming out. There we go. There is our fixed XT30 mount. So now we can mount the flight controller. Now we're going to take our M2 10mm screws as well as these nuts to hold down the flight controller. We're going to feed the screws in through the opposite side. So we're going to flip it over like this. Take one of these screws, feed it through here. You can do this for all four right now. Actually, it'd probably be easiest if we just do that. So let's stick all four into the 25 by 25 mounting, flip it over. Make sure those don't fall out on you when you're flipping it over. You can kind of just hold it like that. And now we can take our flight controller and we can rotate it around so that it sits on that mounting nice. Right like that. So these screws aren't gonna go all the way through. We're gonna actually have to push down on the flight controller a little bit just to get it to grab onto those nuts that we're going to be screwing on. So let's do that real quick just to get this all secured down. These 10mm screws and these nuts right here all came with the frame. These didn't come with the flight controller. Right, so there's one. Make sure those are all screwed in about the same amount, and then we can continue. All right, so now that we got the flight controller all mounted, we got the XT30 ready to go, let's get the motor wires all hooked up. I'm gonna show you this on motor 1, and then you guys can do it with the remaining motors. So if we're looking at it this way, basically motor 1, 2, 3, and 4. If we're looking at the flight controller, now that we flipped it over, this is gonna be motor 1, 2, 3, and 4. So motor 1 is the one that I'm gonna focus on. So I'm gonna pull these wires out just so you guys can see how I do this. I'm gonna run the motor wire along this carbon fiber part right here. It's gonna go right like that. And then for the motor pads, I'm gonna use this right here for motor 1, motor 2, and then motor 3 and motor 4. So like I said earlier, we're gonna have to do some remapping because technically this board is supposed to be sitting like this, but it's simple. So I'll show you guys how to do that. But these wires I'm gonna run right along here. Just be wary of this little hole right next to the mounting for the flight controller. This is actually used for the battery strap. So just give yourself a little bit of slack, kind of like that. I'm gonna measure it to about here, and I'm gonna just cut my wires right along here. I'm gonna expose the wire. And when you're wiring this up, it doesn't necessarily matter which wire goes to which pad. You've got 3 wires and you've got 3 pads per ESC. All that's gonna do is affect the direction of the motor, and that's something that we can change after the fact in Betaflight when we're tuning. I'm gonna put a little bit of flux on the motor pads. I'm gonna just do it with all of them since I have it out. I'm gonna rotate this just so it's easier for me to do it. We're doing this motor to these pads. So I'm gonna take my soldering iron. So let's put a little bit of solder on these pads and we'll get our motors hooked up. Make sure you tin these wires, just makes it a little bit easier. And now we'll solder them up to the ESC. So So kind of run them how you want them to be ran. I'm going to start with this one right here. I'm going to go at a slight angle. There's 1, 2, and 3. So now that motor is all hooked up. I'm going to take some of this tape that I got. Again, you don't necessarily need this, but it does kind of tidy everything up a little bit, especially when you have the long motor wires like this. Run those wires how you want, right like that. And then take some of this tape and just kind of tape those wires down just to keep everything nice and tidy. You don't need much. I think I put too much on here. Now that motor is secured down, let's do the same for the remaining 3. All right, so all those motor wires are down. I've got motor 1, 2, 3, and 4. Motor 1, I have the wires actually going underneath the board, kind of next to the DJI O3 port. Those go underneath and over to these pads right here. Motor 2 is going also underneath the board and right behind our power connector. And then motor 3 is going straight to these pads, and motor 4 is going straight to these pads. All right, so now let's focus on the video transmitter. Since we're using an O3 Air unit for this build, we're gonna have to make this naked. So we're gonna be using the Flywoo case. I have an entire dedicated video on how to make a naked O3 Air unit, so I'm gonna leave a link to that right up here in the corner. I'll also leave a link down in the description, but you guys can hop over and follow that tutorial on how to do this. One note, when you're doing this, we are not gonna have to make the camera naked. For this build, you can keep the camera just like this. Just worry about the O3 Air unit itself. So let's go do that, and then we'll hop back over here and we'll get it attached to the drone. So I've got my O3 Air unit in the Flywoo Naked case. Got the camera connected. Again, we don't have to make the camera naked on this. This is down to about 18 grams right now. The only thing I haven't installed is the antenna. So let's install the antenna real quick, and this is gonna go into that little piece that they include with the frame. It's this piece right here. We're gonna install this. We can mount it to the frame, and then we'll get the O3 Air unit all mounted up. So feed those wires through like that. You can kind of push the antenna down into this base a little bit, kind of like that. Perfect. Now that we have this piece that mounts to the frame on the antenna, we can now mount the UFL connectors to the O3 Air unit. Once those are on, I'm gonna put this bracket back on the top. So with that antenna all mounted up to the O3 Air unit, this thing is pretty much ready to be installed into the drone. Before we install this in the drone, I'm gonna get my receiver hooked up. If you're not using an additional receiver and you plan on using the O3 receiver that's built into this thing, you can skip this step. Otherwise, next I'm gonna install my receiver and then we'll get the O3 hooked up. We aren't gonna be using this longer antenna. We have a shorter Rush FPV antenna that I'm gonna be using. So with a Crossfire receiver, they include a bunch of wires. If you ended up with a receiver that didn't come with any wires, you probably have a bunch of these from the motors. You could use these. You could also use some of these from the flight controller. These came with a flight controller and will plug into various different plugs. We don't necessarily have stuff that's gonna be using this, so you could always cut these up and use these wires. You got plenty of wires to use. The receiver that I got, the Crossfire Nano, came with a bunch of wires like these. So I'm gonna mainly just use white, yellow, red, and black. So for the receiver, I'm gonna be using this ground 5-volt TX4 and RX4. Those 4 wires are sitting right above the O3 plug, and I'm gonna have the wires actually come out and down the middle. So when we're installing the O3 Air unit, we get these little aluminum, we get these little heat sinks with the frame kit, and these kind of just sit right in the middle here. They lift the O3 Air unit off the frame a little, so this kind of gives you a little channel underneath the O3 Air unit, and it's perfect for cables. So I'm gonna have the cables for the O3 Air unit and the receiver kind of running underneath this, and that's why we have to do this before we install the O3 Air unit. On a Crossfire receiver, we have ground, 5-volt, TX, and RX. TX, we're gonna want to hook up to RX on our flight controller, and then RX, we're gonna want to hook up to TX on our flight controller. Put a little bit of flux on those pads to make it easier to solder. Tin those pads. And now we'll solder up our wires. So I'm gonna have white go to RX or TX. I forget which one this is. What is this? RX? TX? RX. This is RX. Top one's RX. And like that. Yellow underneath. Voltage next to that. And finally, the ground. Now let's hook it up to the flight controller. What I'm gonna do is, on my other setup like this, I have the receiver kind of sitting back here. So we have the O3 Air Unit right here, and then this is kind of on its side, and this puts it in a pretty solid location because you have two little metal standoffs here that kind of hold it in place in between the O3 Air Unit and the standoffs. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to run these wires, and we're probably gonna trim these down a little bit, but remembering that these wires are going to be going underneath the O3 Air Unit, we want to make sure that we have enough slack over here. So say about that much, and now from here to the pads. So I'm going to trim these wires to about, so we'll just snip these off. Strip these ends, we'll tin them up, and we'll get them soldered up to our flight controller. I'm going to put some flux on these pads. I'm actually going to put flux all over these pads because we're going to be doing a little bit of soldering. Before we solder up the receiver, I'm going to plug in our O3 Air Unit cable. You're going to have two cables. You have the one that came with the O3 Air Unit right here, and then this one is the cable that came with the flight controller. Use the cable that came with the flight controller. You can plug either end into the flight controller, and then the other end is just going to plug in to your O3 Air Unit. Plugging this in now just makes it a little bit easier since we're going to be soldering directly above, right like that. Make sure it's plugged in all the way. And this wire is pretty much going to be going underneath the O3 Air Unit with our receiver cables right under it like that, and then plugged in. So we'll probably have these wires up like that a little bit. We'll make it work. Now let's get the receiver ready to go on here. Let's tin the pads. We're using ground 5 volt and then UART 4 right next to it. These pads are extremely small, so if this is one of your first drone builds, I would highly recommend getting one of those practice boards and just kind of practicing on the smaller pads before you attempt something like this, because if you bridge the ground and the voltage, or if you start bridging pads on this, you're gonna probably fry something. So just be careful with this because these pads are extremely small. So we'll do ground. There's ground. Next up is 5 volts right next to it. Next up is TX and RX. And there's our receiver. Now let's install the O3 Air Unit. The frame kit came with these two aluminum pieces. Since we're not using a full-size O3 Air Unit, it doesn't really matter which one goes on which side. As you can see, there's kind of like cutouts, like this one has a cutout for the USB, but that doesn't really make a difference since the thing's naked now. It's just gonna be kind of holding it above the frame so that we can get these wires underneath. So we'll go like that. What you can do to make this a little more tidy, I guess, is take the O3 Air Unit plug, and since this one is longer, I'm going to kind of just measure out how much I need. This is technically going to be plugging in. The plug is like right there, so we're going to just go like that, and I'm actually going to coil these wires up from this point. Perfect. So there's the O3 plug, and then we have our receiver. In the frame kit, they give you two different sized screws that are for the O3 Air Unit. We're only going to be using one of these sets. If you were using a full-size Air Unit, you would be using both of them, but we're only going to be using these taller ones. So this is going to be pretty much going through the frame, through these little brackets that we just put on, and into the naked O3. So let's take out the bigger screws. Okay, so we got our 10mm screws right here. For the O3 Air Unit, when we're mounting this, we're gonna want the antennas facing the carbon fiber. So we're actually gonna have it pretty much right like that with the USB kind of facing us. You're gonna have the coaxial cable for the camera pointing out front. We're gonna coil that up in a bit, but this is how you're gonna have to mount the O3 Air Unit. So Doing this is a little bit difficult just because we do have these two brackets on here and the screw has to go through there. So I'm gonna show you guys a trick on how to do this. First, what we gotta do is take out these 4 screws. Now take the 10mm long screws and we're gonna feed it through these holes right in the front, right like that. Kind of hold it in place underneath. Cool, looks good. So now I'm gonna take this bracket. This is the bracket that goes on the front of the board, and make sure you have it the right way. So this is going to be sitting like that. So when it's flipped upside down, it'll be like that. So now we'll take this bracket right here and we'll do the same thing, just on the opposite end. Again, make sure that it is the right orientation. So since we had it like that over here, and this is upside down, it's gonna be like that. So we'll install that. And these are both going right over the wires that are gonna be underneath the O3 Air unit. So now with those 2 brackets removed, we've got our antennas on. We're gonna pretty much just take this, flip it upside down, and we're gonna put it over that bracket, and we're gonna screw it in from the other side. You'll kind of feel the O3 Air unit kind of sink down into place. And now those screws should stay there for the most part. I had one fall out, but now you can easily screw those into the Naked O3 case. There we go. Now we have our Naked O3 Air unit installed. We've got the power cable coming out the back. We can run that through the antenna. I'll show you guys how to do all that. We got our receiver right in the back. And if any of these have too much slack or too little slack, we can always pull it more or pull it back up this way just to make it a little more clean. So now we'll plug in the video transmitter. Push the power cable between the antenna wires, and this should plug right in. Right like that. I'm gonna grab the excess just so that the wires aren't hanging out back here. Since we coiled it up, makes it nice and easy to grab, so we can just easily kind of pull the wires like that. And all of the excess we can kind of bunch up underneath the camera coaxial cable, kind of like that. Next up, we've got the remote ID module. So I'm using the Drone Tag BS. I like to run the BS with the GPS antenna going down this way and then the Bluetooth antenna going up this way. Just kind of keeps them separate. So in addition to the remote ID module, I'm also going to be installing one of these VTX switches. I have these on a couple different drones. This is actually a newer version that I haven't tried yet, but I have a couple of the older version, and pretty much what this does is this is like a 1 gram board that makes it so that you can turn things on and off using a spare UART on your flight controller, and it just links up to a switch on your controller and you can turn whatever you want on or off. So this is perfect for a remote ID module like this. I'm gonna try to put this in an all-in-one kind of configuration like this. So let me show you where we're gonna have this hooked up. We're gonna need 2 different UARTs. We're gonna have one UART for the switch, and then we're gonna have another UART for the remote ID module. The remote ID module, I'm gonna be powering off of this 3.3 volt and ground. What's up guys, Torn from the future. I just realized that power switch is rated for 7 to 26 volts. So we unfortunately can't power the switch off of the 3.3 volt pad like I was planning. That's right here. Instead, I'm going to be powering it off of the battery pad. Since this drone is going to be 4S, it's only going to be 16 volts. So we're going to wire that up to the battery pad. And then right next to that, I can't really see this. We have 5 volt, and then we have UART 2 right next to that. I'm not actually going to use those two. I'm going to stick to over here just because this is an unused area and we just have more room to work with. So we have UART 3 right here and then UART 1 right here. So UART 1 I'll probably use for the switch, and then UART 3 I'll use for the actual remote ID module. Since the power switch is pretty much just going to be hooked up to the power on the remote ID module, we only need one power source for both of these because power is just going to be going through this. On the board, just so you guys can kind of see what's going on, we have power in right here from there. we're gonna have power coming out and ground coming out. Those are gonna hook up to the remote ID module. And then we have FC, and that's gonna hook up to our spare UART, in this case, UART1. You can use TX or RX, doesn't really make a difference. We're gonna remap it anyways. Pick a UART, I'll show you guys how to remap it. We'll start with UART1. Again, this is the pad that's going to our VTX switch, or our power switch. UART3, this is gonna be hooked up directly to the remote ID module. All right, so these pads are extremely small, and I was just really struggling to get the ground over here to just put some solder on it. So I would recommend actually using one of the grounds over here. Maybe I'd use this one. Use this one on the corner for the ground. I had the solder end up spilling all the way over to the 5-volt pad. So just be careful when you're soldering to this. Like I said, I think the ground pads are just really difficult to solder to on this because they're so small. But I would recommend using the ground here. So I'm gonna use that ground. I'm gonna put a little bit more flux on it just because that was a little crazy. So I got a little bit on the 5-volt, but whatever. We're mainly just gonna be using the ground. This is the remote ID module plug. So I'm gonna plug this in just so that it's connected. Now the ground and the voltage are gonna hook up to our switch. So I'm gonna keep those separate from the UART wires. So now with those wires all separated, we've got our UART wires and our voltage wires. I'm gonna put the heat shrink around the remote ID module just to keep it protected. We've got our antennas on there. And let's shrink it up. There is our remote ID module. So my goal is to kind of have the VTX switch as a part of the remote ID module. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm planning on putting the switch right on the opposite side of the remote ID module. So I'm gonna take the wire and it's gonna go just straight over right like that. So we don't need much wire. I'm gonna cut it right there. And then the excess we can use for when we are wiring this up to the flight controller. So let's get this attached to the switch. I'm gonna just move this out of the way real quick. Tin those wires, baby. Get some flux on this entire board, I guess. Tin all these pads. These are nice and easy to solder to. I'm gonna take one of my spare wires and I'm gonna hook this up to the FC tab on this, and this is gonna be what hooks up to our UART. You can use whatever color you want. I just have a red one laying around. If red will confuse you, use yellow. I don't care, whatever, dude. So now let's hook up the voltage to this. So we've got these two wires right here on the remote ID module. These top two are power out, these two are power in. So these are gonna hook up to the flight controller. These two are gonna hook up to these wires right here. Let's do ground first. There's ground. While we have this board all secured down, let's take the spare black and red wire that we snipped off of the remote ID module, strip those ends, and we're gonna solder this up to the switch. And this is gonna be what hooks up to the flight controller power. And these will attach right on the bottom. Nice. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. I just realized that this switch is rated for 7.5 to 28 volts, even though on their site, I'm just realizing that it says 5 volts to 26 volts. So just to use voltage that we know will work, we're gonna actually hook this up to the battery pad. And now this is gonna sit right like this. So if we run this power cable down along here, we can kind of line it up with the UART cables coming directly off of it. And then we have the VTX switch UART cable right here. Just make sure you keep that separate. So let's get some heat shrink around this. So I'm gonna feed the heat shrink over this, just around both boards so that they stay together. You could do this with zip ties, but since we're gonna be mounting it to the frame, I don't want any of the electronics on the opposite side of this VTX switch to touch the carbon fiber. So move this down like that. And push it down a little bit more. Awesome. So there's our remote ID module on a Switch. And this entire unit weighs 4 grams. Remote ID on a Switch. I'm sure people will ask me, so 4 grams. Since this is how the wires are going to be run, this one over here is for the VTX Switch UART, and then we have power going into the VTX Switch, and then these are obviously just the UART cables for the remote ID module. I'm going to run these wires together, and since we know that the power cables are that long, I'm also going to cut the UART cables that long. And once these 5 wires are all soldered up to the flight controller, we can coil them all together. I'm actually going to cut this additional wire to the same length as well, just to keep it all the same. All right, so just to make sure that we're clear on which pads I'm using, I'm going to be using the battery pad right here to power everything. We've got a ground right above that. Over here we have R3 and T3. UART3 is going to be used for the remote ID module, and then we have R1 right here, and we're going to remap this after the fact, but this is going to be used for the Switch. Let's wire it up. All right, let's do the voltage for the Switch first. There's also voltage for the remote ID module. This is being hooked up to the bat. And then let's just get this out of the way. I'm gonna do ground next. Ground is definitely the most difficult on this board. So next, let's get our UART pads hooked up. I've got the yellow wire going to RX on the remote ID module, so we're gonna wanna hook up TX on the flight controller, and then the same thing with the white wire. Going to TX on here, hook it up to RX on the flight controller. So yellow is gonna go to TX, and white is going to RX right next to it. And last but not least, we gotta hook up our wire for the Switch. So this is going to R1 right here. Boom. I think we're done soldering. So with this remote ID module now all hooked up, we can kind of coil up all these wires, don't get the antenna mixed in with the wires. Since we're done soldering, now's a good time to kind of test everything and make sure that it's powering up. Before we do that, let's throw our antenna on our receiver. I'm not really sure if you should be powering up your receiver. As far as video transmitters go, you want your antenna always connected. Don't turn on a video transmitter if you don't have your antenna connected. So I kind of treat receivers the same way. So I'm gonna put this antenna on here just for now. We are probably gonna take this off because we have to put heat shrink around this still, but I'm gonna put the antenna on. There we go, we got our receiver antenna on. So now we're good to plug a battery into this. Now before you just take a battery and just plug it in and hope it turns on, if you have any shorts on the board anywhere that you overlooked and you plug a battery in, you're probably gonna ruin your board. So I would highly recommend getting something like this smoke stopper. I have this one that has XT30 and XT60. Unfortunately, this one's not gonna work because we have a PCB underneath here that's actually kind of blocking this. So instead of using this one, I'm gonna be using this one, and I have a couple adapters that I'm gonna use with it just so that it works with this XT30 battery that I have. But I would recommend getting one of these, especially if you're new to building drones, because what this is gonna do is when I plug a battery into here, a light's gonna turn on, and pretty much it's pushing power from the battery into this. If we plug this into the drone and there's a short somewhere, this is gonna recognize it and it's gonna completely cut off power. So this little $5 piece could potentially save your $80 flight controller. So let's plug this in, see if it turns on, see how everything's looking. Looks good. Since I know that there's no shorts anywhere on it, I'm gonna plug the battery straight in. Right like that. And we have a red light on the VTX switch, so once we get this wired up with Betaflight, we'll be able to turn this on and off. Flight controller's on, the O3 Air Unit is on, and our receiver is on. Awesome. So now we can unplug, and now we can put this all together. All right, so since this is turning on and everything appears to be working as it should, what I'm gonna do next is I am going to put some heat shrink around the receiver. So I'm gonna keep this antenna actually plugged in. I'm gonna rotate the antenna around like that so the antenna is coming out near the wires. I'm gonna take this heat shrink, put it over it, and shrink it. Looks good. Let's get our camera mounted up to its bracket. So we have a couple different pieces here. The O3 Air Unit camera should come with these screws already in it. So if they're in the camera, remove it. And what we're gonna do is the camera is gonna mount to these carbon fiber pieces, and then these carbon fiber pieces are gonna mount to this, and then this is gonna mount to the frame. So let's start with these carbon fiber pieces. These actually take these 4 grommets, and these came with the frame. Take these. Also take the floss that we used earlier for these grommets, and this will just make it easier. And feed it through the hole. Put the grommet through the floss and pull it through. Once you have that all set, make sure you do the same for the hole right next to it, and then do it on the other one too. Make sure that you have the thick side down on both of them. Don't have one of them have the thick side on the bottom and then the other side on the top, because you won't be able to mount the camera. Once you have those grommets in, we can mount them to the camera. So now we'll take these 4 8mm M2 screws, and these are going to be used to mount the camera. The thicker side of the grommet is the side that we're going to want on the camera. You're going to notice there's a big hole and a small hole. The small hole is going to be used to mount to the metal piece later on. For now, we're going to have the bigger hole towards the front. So right like that. There's one of the mounts. Now let's do the same to the side. And there's our camera mount. Now we're going to mount these other camera brackets as well as the standoffs. So these are all held in with the same screws. For these, we're going to be using these smaller screws right here. Grab one of those smaller screws. I'm going to go towards the front of the drone. Hopefully you guys can see this. Hey guys, Torn from the future here. Don't install these camera brackets like this. You want this groove on the outside, not on the inside. Screw it on like that, and there's the first camera mount. We'll get to mounting the camera. We'll get to mounting the actual camera in a second. Right now, let's just put on our standoffs. You'll notice on the outer ring of the frame, we've got 4 screw holes, one right here. A standoff is gonna go right in there. One right here. And then the last 2 spots right in the back next to the O3 Air Unit, right on the sides, right there. This one and this one. These rear 2 standoffs right here that I just put in are perfect for holding the receiver. So let's actually get that secured first. So before we put the top plate on, we got to get all this secured down. So the way that I like to run this on my other QAV Nano, pretty much I have the antenna sitting right back here in between the standoffs and the O3 Air Unit, and it's perfect for it. So you can run this cable kind of around this way, and then just have the receiver kind of sit right in here. If you're having trouble getting the receiver installed in the back here, just loosen up the screws on these 2 standoffs, and then what you can do is just move these back, tuck the receiver in, and now you can tighten them down, and it's gonna hold the receiver in place. Right like that. So there's our receiver, and what we can do is we can then have the antenna go right up here, and we'll secure it to the O3 antenna. So let's run the camera Actually, before we run the camera, let's secure down our remote ID module. With these wires all coiled up, I'm gonna have mine sit kind of like this. So I have the GPS antenna, the longer antenna, going towards the front of the drone, and then the Bluetooth antenna going towards the back. I'm gonna have the Bluetooth antenna just going right over the O3 Air Unit. We've got plenty of space there between the carbon fiber and the O3 Air Unit. And then for the front, this is just gonna pretty much end up going behind the camera. So to secure this down, you get about 6 of these zip ties with the QAV frame. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to connect this right like this, and I'm gonna feed the remote ID module through, and now we can loop the capacitor in, and now those are together, and I'm gonna have this just sit right like that. So now the remote ID module is secured to the capacitor, and we have plenty of space above it to put that last carbon fiber plate on top. Cut off any excess. So now we'll take our camera, I'm gonna coil it up a little bit. I'm gonna have the coaxial cable run along this side of the drone, kind of underneath the zip tie behind the USB, next to the power cables, and then right down the side. And now the camera should fit right in those grooves, right like that. So we'll take 2 of these smaller screws. So now if you want to adjust your camera angle, you just adjust those 2 screws. The camera is still dampened and you can adjust it as you need. I really like the way that they dampen the camera on this. Make sure everything's looking nice and clean like that. Once we've got the standoffs mounted, the camera mounted, and everything all secured, it's time to put the top plate on. When we're mounting the top plate, there's really no direction that it goes other than this is the rear of the drone. So you can have it like that, or you can have it like that. Doesn't make any difference. Make sure this antenna is coming out here. Make sure everything's looking good. Put that GPS antenna just kind of beside the camera, I guess, like in there. And we're gonna lower this down. You're probably gonna push down a little bit, but that's okay. You do have room to push down. Now we'll install these smaller screws all the way around this plate. These smaller screws aren't big enough for the 2 holes, so I'm actually going to use some of the screws that came with the motors, because these are a little bit longer. With our O3 antenna secured down, we can now secure our receiver antenna to this antenna. To do this, I'm going to use 2 more zip ties that came with our frame, right like that. And now I'm just going to snip off the excess zip tie. Oh, I cut my antenna. Just kidding. I also have this GoPro mount. This is for a naked GoPro because this drone is meant to be used with a naked GoPro, and it's still under the 250 gram limit. We've got this battery pad right here. I'm gonna put this on. This just goes right in the middle on the top. Boom, right like that. We got some little rubber feet that came with this. I totally forgot about these. So these go on the bottom underneath these 4. So I'm gonna remove those and install those now. Let's put our battery strap on here. This battery strap can be a little difficult to get in. The way that this works is you could either have it just kind of go around these loops like this, and I think for some bigger batteries, this is probably how you want it. This is how I have it on my 6S Cinewhoops on the QAV 2.5 inch frame. But what I would recommend doing is you got a little hole next to this lip. We're gonna feed this through it and then kind of push it all the way through and then push that up and around that loop. So then when it loops around like that, it's nice and secure, so you can do that to both sides. There you go. There's your battery strap. Nice and secure, that thing ain't falling off. I like this battery strap system. I love this. If you're using one of these GoPro mounts, you are gonna need longer screws because the stock short screws aren't gonna work. So I would get something like these. So you can actually, for these screws, if you have a GoPro mount, you can actually use some of the screws that came with the motors. The original motor mounting screws that came with the Flywoo motors, you can use those to mount this front mount and this O3 mount. All right, so now we're gonna hop over to do some tuning. If you built this drone exactly how I did with the exact same parts, I will include a download link to the CLI so you can just paste that into Betaflight CLI and you should be good to go. Otherwise, if you wanna go step by step, let's get into it. All right, so to start tuning, we're gonna make sure that we don't have any props on here, and this flight controller takes a USB micro. I think this is a USB micro. We're gonna plug this into the flight controller. We don't need a battery plugged in yet. Once we get ESC configurator going, we are gonna need to plug a battery into this. So I'm gonna plug this in. The other end is connected to my computer, and we're gonna launch ESC configurator. So if you have Betaflight running in the background, it's gonna try and connect to that, and then you won't be able to do this. So just make sure you don't have Betaflight running in the background. And then we're gonna go up to connect, and we're gonna plug a battery in. When you're doing this, you might want a fan on the O3 Air Unit. We're only using this program for a short period of time, so I'm just gonna have this plugged in without a fan, but I'm gonna plug this battery in. It's gonna start up. And now in ESC configurator, we're gonna hit read settings, and it's gonna basically just read the 4 ESCs on there. So as you can see, it's running BL Heli S. We want to change that to Blue Jay. So to do that, we're going to hit flash all ESCs. We're going to select Blue Jay, and then version 19.2. PWM frequency, we're going to set to 24, and then we're going to hit flash. So now this is going to slowly flash each individual ESC, and then we'll be able to continue. When this is doing its thing, do not unplug anything, otherwise you're going to run into issues on your ESC. Perfect. So now that Blue Jay is all flashed to the ESCs, we can adjust the volume, we can adjust a couple additional settings in here. Otherwise, we're all set in the ESC configurator, so I'm gonna hit disconnect. And we can close this, and we're gonna launch Betaflight. So since we're all set with ESC configurator, I'm gonna unplug the drone just so the O3 Air Unit doesn't overheat. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to update the firmware. So you should be able to connect to it, and you'll see what firmware you're running, 4.4.3. I'm pretty sure that's the latest version for this drone, but I'll show you guys how to update the firmware anyways. Hit update firmware, auto detect. It should show up with Hakrc F722D. That is the flight controller that I use in here. If you use a different flight controller, just make sure that you can see the name of the flight controller that you used. 4.4.3, that is the latest version. That looks good, full chip erase. Make sure you select the radio protocol that you're using. I'm using Crossfire. If you're using ELRS, select Crossfire. Looks good. Cool. We'll load firmware online and flash firmware. There's nothing on this flight controller, so we can ignore the risk, and it's going to start flashing. All right, so once that's all set, we're going to hit connect and apply custom defaults. And once it boots up, you're gonna notice that the board is gonna look upside down, or at least it should. So since we installed the board upside down on here, in Betaflight, it's gonna be upside down. There's no motor output protocol selected. We'll select D-Shot later, and the accelerometer is enabled but not calibrated. So off the bat, you'll probably wanna calibrate the accelerometer, but we're not gonna do that. See how the drone's upside down? What we want to do is we want to tell Betaflight that the flight controller is upside down. So to do that, we're going to hop over to configuration, and we're going to change roll to 180, and then we're going to change yaw to 135. Under here, I'm going to adjust these while I'm in this tab, RX loss, RX set. That's going to basically just enable the beeper function, and I'm going to adjust the arming to 180. And we're going to turn GPS on. If you're not using the remote ID module, you won't have GPS unless you install a GPS. I'm going to be using the drone tag BS as the GPS module, so I'm going to enable GPS. That looks pretty good. So I'll hit save and reboot. And now when it boots up, the drone should be right side up. Front is front, back is back, yaw, everything looks correct in Betaflight, so that's good. So once you have it to that point, then you can hit calibrate accelerometer and you'll be good. Now let's hop over to the ports tab. So this is where we can configure all the different things that we hooked up, like our receiver, the DJI O3 Air Unit, and the remote ID module. So off the bat, Serial RX, that is the receiver. So the receiver we didn't put on UART2, we actually put that on UART4, so we're gonna turn that on here. We have the DJI O3 Air Unit on UART6, so we're gonna hit Configuration MSP right here, and then we're gonna go down to the Peripherals tab, and we're gonna put VTX MSP DisplayPort on. And then the remote ID module is hooked up to UART3. And since I'm using that for GPS, we're gonna hit this and turn on GPS. And that should be pretty much it. Since we have the switch on UART1, I think it was, we don't have to do anything in this right here. We're gonna hop down to the CLI and do that in a second, but this is how you want it configured for this setup right here. So we'll hit Save Reboot. Looks good, and there's no motor output protocol selected, so we'll do that in a minute. Right now, let's hop down to presets. Let's do the presets, do a little bit of tuning. So for tuning this drone, you're gonna wanna select the OSD for FPV.WTF DJI O3 Avatar HD. So this is gonna make it so that you can see the OSD elements in your goggles. So this is on UART6, click the drop down, make sure these two are selected, and we'll go UART6, enable that, pick. And then use this Cinewhoop tune right here as a base tune. We're gonna adjust a couple settings, but keep medium build quality, and we're gonna change this from 48K to 24K. And keep those other ones off. That looks good. Pick, agree, and then save reboot. We'll close this, and now let's hop down to some PID tuning. So this base tune from UAV Tech is actually really good on this drone. You could fly it as is, but I've noticed a little bit better performance when I adjust some of these settings. So damping is currently at 1.4. We're gonna keep that at 1.4, and we're gonna bring the tracking up to 1.25. Dynamic damping, we're gonna bring that up to 0.25. And the rest of it looks pretty good. So we'll keep all that the same. This tune performs pretty good on this drone. So let's save. Now I'll hop over to rate profile settings, and I'm gonna put in my rates that I like for indoor flight. I'm gonna change the throttle limit from off to scale because sometimes I like to adjust this depending on the build. I think this one's pretty good at 100, so I'm just gonna keep that at 100, but I'm gonna have scale on, and let's save. And then in the filter settings, we don't have to adjust anything. This is pretty good. Perfect. So we've got the tune all set. We've got our presets selected. Let's hop over to the receiver tab, and now we can configure all the switches on our controller. So I'm using Crossfire on this drone. I already have the receiver bound to my controller. So when I turn this on, it's not gonna connect to the receiver because we have to plug a battery in. So I'm gonna plug a battery in. Once that connects on the screen, we can see that it thinks that throttle is roll and roll is pitch. So it's kind of all messed up. So to fix that, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to channel map, and we're gonna change that to spectrum, save, and now throttle's throttle, roll is roll, pitch is pitch, and it all looks pretty good. So once that's set up, we're pretty much all set in this tab. Now we'll hop over to the modes tab, and this is where we can configure all of our switches. So we're gonna set up arm, add range, and you wanna make sure you have auto selected. So now what you wanna do is just click down on the switch that you wanna use for the arm switch. I'm gonna use this one to arm. Once you click that on your computer screen, you should see that little yellow dot moving. So we want that to be armed. So I'm gonna adjust this to be like that. And then we'll go down and select all the other little things that you want configured on your drone. All right, so that looks pretty good for now. We don't have flip over after crash because we haven't configured our motor output, our motor protocol, so we'll do that next. But once you have these switches set up, you can just hit save. Flick the switches around, make sure they do what you want them to do. Looks good. I'm gonna unplug the battery, because we don't want that O3 Air Unit to overheat. All right, so now that we have this set up, I kind of want to show you guys how to get that switch set up for the remote ID module. So to do this, we're going to hop down to CLI, and we're going to type resource. And if you remember when we were installing the switch on here, we used UART1 on the RX pad. So what we're going to do is we're going to find UART1 on the RX pad. So that would be this one right here. So pin A10, and what we're going to do is we're going to copy this. Resource serial RX1. You do this for whatever UART you used. I'm gonna paste it down here, and then we're gonna say none. So that's pretty much gonna free up that RX1 pad that we connected the trigger to. So now with that pin freed, what we can do is we can set up a pin IO box on that pin. So to do this, we'll type resource pin IO 1, and then you select the pin that you used. So we're using pin A10, so A10, and pin IO 1 is set to A10. Now we're gonna do some other commands that I honestly don't really know what this does, but it sets it up correctly. So just type set pin IO underscore box equals 40, comma, 41, comma, 42, comma, 43. And then hit save. So now what should happen is we should see an additional switch underneath the modes tab. So if we go under here, hide unused modes, and we scroll down towards the bottom, you're gonna see user 1, I think it is. Yeah, user 1. So user 1 is linked to the VTX switch that is hooked up to our remote ID module. So we'll hit add range. I'm gonna plug in a battery to the drone again. So I want this red switch right here to be able to turn my remote ID module on or off. So what we want to do is change this to auto. We're going to change that to be that right here. So I want it to be on when it's in this spot. So now when I flick this up, the remote ID module should be off. And when it's down like this, the remote ID module should be on. Hopefully you guys can see this. There's a little tiny LED on there, that yellow LED. So when I go like this, turns it off, and now we've got remote ID on. Off, on, off, on. So that is how you set up the remote ID module on a switch. I'm gonna unplug this so the O3 Air Unit doesn't overheat. Now that that's all set up, we'll hit save. And now finally we're gonna hop down to the motors tab. So ESC motor protocol, we're gonna change this to DShot 600. And now we're gonna set up and now with that enabled, we can go back under our modes tab, and we should have a flip over after crash. There it is. So make sure you set this up. I would definitely set it up. And to do this, you'll obviously need a battery plugged in. Cool. Change this to auto, and I want this one to be flip over after crash. Cool. So we got all our switches set up. That's pretty much everything that we have to do in here. That's the remote ID on a switch, flip over after crash, the beeper, angle mode, and arm. I'm probably also going to eventually put air mode on a switch. Actually, I'll show you guys how to do that. Go back into configuration, and we're gonna turn, is it not on? Air mode, this is it. Turn air mode off, and that's gonna let you put air mode on a switch. So I like having it on a switch because I've noticed that drones actually fly better indoors with air mode off. So once that's off, we're gonna hop down to modes, and there should also be an air mode switch now. So we'll go air mode. And I usually just use the same switch that I use for angle mode. Even though I don't use angle mode, I kind of just like having it as a backup. So I'm gonna have air mode on the same switch right in the middle, and it should be good. So that is everything that you have to do for the switches. Now let's hop down to the motors. We're gonna get these motors spinning the right direction, make sure that it knows what motor is what, and we'll be pretty much all set. So I'm gonna unplug this and let it cool down for a second, and then we'll hop back and we'll do these motors. All right, so to do the motors, we got a battery plugged in here. I have a little PC fan right here that is hooked up to a 3S LiPo. What we're gonna do is we first have to tell the flight controller that this is motor 1, this is motor 2, this is motor 3, and this is motor 4. Since we installed the flight controller upside down and rotate and everything, it thinks that this is motor 1, 2, 3. It's all messed up. So to tell it that the motors are laid out like this, what we're gonna do is hit reorder motors. I understand the risks. Again, don't have any props on when you're doing this. We're gonna hit start. So now a motor is gonna start spinning, and all you have to do is click the motor that's spinning. So for me, this one is spinning right now. So I'm gonna click this one. Now it's the one underneath. Now it's this one. And now it's this one. So now hit save. And now the flight controller should know that this is motor 1, this is motor 2, this is motor 3, and this is motor 4. To test this, we'll go back to the motors tab and we're going to turn this on. We're going to spin up motor 1. Now this one should be spinning. For me, this one's spinning. This is spinning in that direction, so this is reversed. We're going to have to change the direction of the motors, but that's pretty easy. Now this one's spinning. That's spinning that direction as well. Now we have motor 3. That's spinning that direction too. And that's spinning that direction too. So all of the motors are spinning the same direction, but it knows that this is motor 1, this is motor 2, this is motor 3, and this is motor 4. So that's the most important thing first. Now we'll hit motor direction. So this is going to help us change the direction of each motor. Now I prefer doing the wizard. So hit wizard, start spin motors. It's going to spin all of the motors, and pretty much what we want to do is make sure that each motor is spinning the direction that this says. So we want motor 1 and 4 spinning clockwise and motors 2 and 3 spinning counterclockwise. So if I feel the motors right now, motor 1 is spinning counterclockwise, counterclockwise, counterclockwise. They're all spinning counterclockwise. So all I have to do is select 1 and 4, and that's it. So now 4 should be spinning clockwise and 1's clockwise. Perfect. And that's all you have to do in the motors tab. That will automatically save. To double check everything, you can just go in here and slowly spin up each motor and just make sure that it's still spinning the correct way. Perfect. So I'm going to unplug this just so the O3 doesn't overheat, even though we have that fan going. And now really the last thing that you have to do is just set up your OSD. Usually I have them left justified over here. I'm not going to show you how to do this. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah. If you wanted to set up GPS, you could. I'm not going to set that up in this video, but since we have it connected to a UART, you can use it as a GPS. So you can set return home, and you can, change all the fail-safe settings and all that good stuff. So, yeah. All right, so now that this is all tuned, let's throw some props on here and we'll check the weight. Make sure you remember which way the props are supposed to be facing when you're installing them. Mine are technically props out, so I'm gonna make sure that I install them that way. Finally, with a 720 milliamp 4S LiPo, balance lead, and a naked GoPro Hero 11 in the new Flywoo case, you're looking at 249 grams on the dot. Boom! This thing's sick. So there you go, guys. That's how to build a 2-inch Cinewhoop that's under 250 grams. It has DJI O3 on board and can carry a naked GoPro with remote ID on a Switch. In total, to build this drone, you're looking at about $550 for the drone alone with remote ID. If you remove the drone tag BS, you're looking at about 500 bucks. And if you wanted to go with a VTX other than the O3, you'll save even more money. I like using the O3 because I actually use it as a backup camera to my GoPro. So if something happens to my GoPro, I'll always have the O3 recording as a backup. Plus the image transmission quality is the best you can get. If you decide to go with any other components than what I used in this video, just keep an eye on the weight. This build right here is on the line at 249 grams, so any minor adjustment in parts could push you over that 250 gram limit. Some ways that you could save weight if you needed to: you could use a smaller battery like a 550 milliamp instead of a 720 like I have here. You could swap the stock DJI antenna for some dipole antennas, and you could make the O3 camera naked instead of using a full-size camera like I did here. If you do that, you'll just have to figure out how you can mount that naked camera to these brackets. Something else that just came to mind: if you do need to shave off a couple grams of weight on this drone, you can swap out the case from the Flywoo case. This is probably the most heavy naked GoPro case that you can get. This case is made out of CNC aluminum, so it's definitely on the heavier side, but you could get the Nameless RC case or the Gep RC case. Both of those are going to be lighter weight than this. So that's going to do it for this build, guys. If this helped you out, make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave the video a like, and if you have any questions when building this drone, leave a comment down below.